Today I want to talk about a debate that every book lover has probably had at some point, which is what's better, hardback or paperback? Hello and welcome to my channel. The reason why I wanted to talk about hardback and paperback editions is because for a long time I did not care. If I was reserving a book from a library, I wouldn't even look at the edition. I'd just get whatever was likely to arrive sooner. If I was buying a book, then I'd just simply look at the price. But recently I have realized I have been very clearly leaning towards one side, which I'll explain in a bit which side that is. And we also will be going through some examples that I have behind me of same book in two different editions, hardback and paperback. But before we do that, let's very quickly cover pros and cons of each type of edition. First of all, of course, the price will be very different for a new hardback and for a new paperback because hardbacks are more expensive. For me personally, that doesn't matter as much because 70% of the books that I read come from a library and the other 30% are used books, which I buy from usually the World of Books. I used to use eBay a lot. Now I have come to love the World of Books website so much that I pretty much use only that. Then we've got release timings. If you're desperate to read a particular book and it is a new book, you will have to get a hardback because paperbacks often are not released until 6 months later or even a year after the hardback was published. Then we have weight and portability, and this is, I guess, where paperbacks hands down win because they are much obviously lighter and easier to transport, although some people may actually prefer to hold a heavier book in their hands. The next factor is durability, and because hardbacks are obviously made from a harder material, at least the cover is made from a harder material, they will last longer. They also have a dust jacket which further offers some protection. Also, it is only with a hardback that you can have, or you tend to have, pages combined together by stitching and not by them being glued. Now, I will be showing you in a minute some big hardbacks where pages are still glued, and from my experience, the stitching is quite a rare occasion, except for Everyman's Library, at least the classic editions where the pages are definitely stitched and not glued. However, for this purpose, I want to leave classics out of this discussion because they are a completely different category in itself. But I did want to mention the stitching because I think stitching does contribute to a longer life of a book because obviously the pages will not fall out as easily. I would be very interested to know whether any of the publishers actually publish books such as these that are not classics. Then we've got obviously the factor of annotating. If you're someone who likes to write inside their books, then whether a book is a hardback or a paperback is definitely a consideration because you may find that it is actually easier potentially to annotate if you have a paperback. Also, it feels like less of a crime if you are writing in a paperback as opposed to in an expensive hardback. I personally don't annotate inside my books, not because I'm precious about my books, but just because it's a very, very old habit from my days when I never used to own books, and even at university, most students couldn't afford books and we would all be very much used to a research library. We also have to talk about purpose because it seems that lots of people, when it comes to collecting books, tend to prefer hardbacks over paperbacks. They just look better on the shelf, they last longer, and so I guess we can assume that paperbacks are more friendly when it comes to reading, and maybe hardbacks are for collecting. Maybe, because I'm not saying I am going to solve this debate in this video, but let's continue unwrapping this topic and let's get to the final criteria, which is a reading experience, which for me is the main deciding factor when it comes to preferring one edition over the other. If you watched my deep dive into various classic editions, of which, by the way, episode 2 is coming, mostly because lots of you have told me about yet more classic editions which were not covered in my first episode, so I'm very happy to report that I have now collected at least one book from each of those editions, and I can't wait to talk to you about them. Anyway, if you've watched that video, you know that I have very specific criteria when it comes to choosing my favorite book edition, and the two key criteria for me personally, and for you that may be something entirely different, is one, the font of the text. And listen, it's not that I just can't read small letters. I can perfectly well read small letters, but I don't want to struggle unnecessarily, okay? And then the number two is it really helps if you can open your book flat. Okay, so now you would think that the difference in paperbacks and hardbacks are so big that it would be easy to choose one preferred edition over the other. Well, no, we have no such luck. And that's because of the inconsistency of various editions. So let's have a look at the various books that I have on my table behind me. I'm starting with the largest hard copy that I have, which is this beast by Hilary, Mantel, titled Wolf Hall. So this is a hardback. It is a massive book. If you've read it, you know this is almost 700 pages, and I have a paperback version as well. Now, what you will find with most of paperbacks is that definitely the font in the paperback will be smaller than in a hardback, just because you've got smaller workspace to work with. So let's open these up and let's have a closer look, and you can tell that the font in the hardback is definitely bigger. Not only that, the margins are bigger. I think when you're reading, especially a massive book like this one, you want to have as comfortable experience as you can. And for me, in this case, I will definitely be going for a hardback, just because I mostly now read at home. I used to have quite a lot of commute time, which means in those days I would have probably chosen the paperback, which is obviously more portable. But in terms of everything else, I am one of those people now, apparently, who does like to have a heavier book in their hands, and also I want the font to be bigger. I want there to be more white spaces in relation to the margins, or even spaces in between the lines or the paragraphs, because your eye will not get as tired when you get more white spaces. Having said all that, I do need to mention that in this case, this particular hardback doesn't necessarily stay completely flat when you open it, which is a bit annoying. But of course, you can, to a certain extent, help yourself by bending the back. And that goes for both for paperbacks. This spine has been bended quite a lot, as you can tell. This is a used book. Both of these are used books. I picked them up at a charity store. One other thing I haven't mentioned is the paper thickness. Obviously, in the hardback, the paper will be much thicker than in a paperback. However, in this case, this doesn't really seem to affect the level to which you can see the font peeking through from another page. It seems to be the same in both books. So that's a super heavyweight novel. For the next example, we're going to the most sort of a standard size book. These are both 400 and 300 pages long novels. And now I wanted to have two in this category just because even though the sizes are the same and on face of it they fairly similar, the editions obviously can vary because of different publishers. So let's take this one first. This is Long Island. Again, font definitely bigger in the hardback comparing to paperback. In this case, the hardback is very bouncy and definitely does not stay open very well. I would have to break the spine quite a lot, which I don't want to do because as you can see this is a library copy. Now this is my own copy again. Great little find in a charity store, and you know, while the cover stays flat you can't say the same for the pages because they also a little bit bouncy. But let's see what happens if I break the back. Much better already. And so as a comparison, you've got this Ann Tyler's novel where actually the paperback feels like it's super comfortable to hold. I'm just checking the weight of both books because for some reason this one seems lighter, although I don't know if it's just one of those perception things because it is definitely much more comfortable to hold. Look at this, it opens flat, and actually the font in this particular edition is huge. Now where I opened the page I can tell that it opened flat so easily because the pages are glued, and actually here the book starts to slowly disintegrate. But even if we open on another page you can tell this stays flat so much better than the previous paperback. Now with this particular edition, this is an interesting fact because it seems to me that the font in both copies is either exactly the same or, dare I say it, the paperback actually has a larger font. Just by a tiny bit. This is paperback and on my right is the hardback. I have never seen actually anything like this before. This is the first time I see paperback having a larger font than the hardback. But again, the pages are definitely thicker and obviously the margins are larger in the hardback. Next, let me show you what I would call a medium size books. So if I just take back the previous novel, you can see the difference in sizes here. This one on my left is slightly smaller. It's not a small book, but it's smaller than your typical large size. And again, I have library copy in its paperback version. So let's open them up. The font in hardback here is bigger, but not by a huge amount. However, again, the paper is thicker and the margins are bigger. When it comes to staying open flat, this paperback seems to have been already quite bended. So yes, it does stay flat quite nicely, whereas the hardback bounces a little bit, as you can see. Now this next book is where my whole reflection on hardback versus paperback originated from, because I found this paperback of the Thorn Birds in an Airbnb where we were staying over the summer in Croatia, and I've run out of books to read, and the Airbnb owner very kindly let me keep that book, which I have made a quite good dent in it before we left, and I wanted to keep reading it because since I've started reading it I have been obsessed with this saga. By the time you're watching this video, will have probably covered this in one of my reading wrap-ups, or if I haven't yet, then this is something you can look forward to, because despite this being such a well-known classic, and especially its TV adaptation was so popular, I had really no idea what it was about, and the story in it is just blowing my mind. And I'm not talking about the the romance theme in there. The whole story of what it was like to live in rural Australia in the early 20th century is just so fascinating. Anyway, I'm digressing. So I got this paperback and I got home, and because the font in this particular edition, I'll show you in comparison to hardback in a minute, is so tiny. It was driving me mad and I just couldn't help myself. I went on the World of Books website and I purchased myself a used copy of a hardback version, and I'm so happy I did. Obviously this is a quite old edition. This is from 1970s. The pages are quite yellow, and it's interesting because despite this being such a huge book, this book has definitely over 500 pages, probably closer to 600. So despite its size, the publishers at the time decided to publish it in this medium sort of size, as opposed to, again, let's grab the previous book, the normal large size, which would be my preference because it would be a little bit more comfortable to read it. However, there's no question that in terms of the font, in this case, the hardback definitely wins. I mean, look at this. And also in terms of the spaces between the paragraphs. Now, obviously, if you're not a fan of yellow or creamy pages, this won't be for you, and you may still prefer to read a paper copy. But for me personally, this has been such a win. And like I said, I can't wait to talk to you about this book. And finally, let's talk about the smallest books, which sometimes also come in hardback version, although most of them will probably be in paperback version because of their size. This is how small this book is. Unfortunately, I do not have a paperback version of this, but this is a very well-known book and I did read it in paperback version. This is a library copy, by the way. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with this book because it's such a short novella that you can still very comfortably open the pages and it's not too bouncy, and also the font is quite big because, again, it's a very short novella. However, as another example, let's compare this, another small size book by Elizabeth Stroud, but this one is a bigger novel, and I don't have the same exact novel by Elizabeth Stroud in paperback, but I have her other novel, O William, and I can vouch that the paperback edition of all of Elizabeth Stroud novels here in the UK looks the same. So I think it's fair to compare these two. And look what happens, because this is a big novel and because the size of this edition is smaller. This is so bouncy. Did you see this? That even the cover doesn't stay flat open on your reading surface, which is extremely annoying. And actually, this is probably one of those rare occasions where I would say paperback, look at this. It stays open. The paperback is more comfortable to read than a hardback. So when it comes to smaller editions, in terms of the size smaller, watch out for the number of pages, because I think it's very difficult to get right a hardback edition in a smaller size of a novel that actually is not your shortest novel. So you may ask, where do I land? Well, at the moment, as you may have guessed from this video, I'm definitely team hardback, and not because of their durability, because I'm not precious about my books and I'm not really a book collector in the sense that I want to have these pristine collections of books. The main reason why I prefer hardbacks is that overall, even though there are still some inconsistencies, I find the reading experience better for me, even though of course you have to compromise on the fact that the book will be heavier, but I almost prefer that. And I suspect there must be still a lot of people who love hardbacks, because otherwise what would be the point of publishing them if they weren't selling? Unless you'll tell me that this is why the publishers deliberately space out release of hardbacks with paperbacks to get more money from the clientele, because obviously hardbacks are more expensive. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts, and very, very interested to hear which version you prefer overall, or maybe you don't care. Or maybe like me, you've been through a bit of a journey where you changed your mind quite a few times in your life, and depending on your life circumstances, your preferences have changed. Did that happen to you as well? Please let me know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next week on the Friday. Bye for now.